We're now going to start talking about some of the combining operators in the Flux class. And there are, once again, a boatload of these things. We're going to start by talking about two of them, repeat and merge with. And what these operators do is they create a flux from either multiple sources, like another flux, or by iterating multiple times and applying some operation and then making that into the flux that's generated. So let's start by talking about repeat, which is actually a very interesting operator. It turns out to be useful for generating data, test cases or other types of things. What it does is repeat returns a flux that repeats the sequence of items emitted by the flux that it's called on a given number of times. And the number of times is passed as the parameter. So this is the number of times to have this flux called. This will make more sense when you see the example. Now, what's weird about this, and this is a little different from RxJava, this results in num repeat plus 1 total subscriptions to the original source. So you'll always get at least one item even if you give a 0, which is weird. So if you give a 0, it will still play back the input once. And this behavior is somewhat different, or it's different from the way that RxJava's repeat operator works on an observable, which is often cause for confusion. I've run into that before. So they're not the same. They're like comparing apples and oranges, or apples and oranges. So what happens is this returns a new flux instance that will repeat every time its onComplete operation is called up to the specified number of repetitions. So let's take a look at an example and see why you would ever want to do something crazy like this. So here's what we're going to do. We are going to use the from method. So remember, from is this lazily processed method that will not be done at assembly time. It'll be done at runtime when someone subscribes. And what we're going to have from do is we're going to have from make a random BigFraction. So it's going to call from callable, which is a mono factory method, and this will make one random BigFraction. And then we're going to say repeat this creating of the random BigFraction 3 more times. So we'll end up with a total of 4 random and reduced BigFractions. So this is just a way, it's kind of like a loop, I guess is the best way to look at it. It's sort of the reactive version of a for loop or for each loop kind of thing. There is something in RxJava that works the same way. I think there might be a bug here. This should probably say repeat 4, because if you want 4 random reduced BigFractions, you have to give it this extra 1, whereas with RxJava, with Project Reactor, you only have to say 3 because it'll always do it one time. So I'll fix that in the final version of the slides. There's really nothing quite like that in Java streams. There's stuff you can do that's sort of like that, but there's no repeat operation. The next operator we're going to talk about is much more interesting and much more useful. It's called mergeWith. And what it does is it takes the data that's in the flux that's calling mergeWith, and it takes a publisher, which can emit values, and it will end up, as the name suggests, merging them or combining them into an interleaved merge sequence, or merged sequence. And we'll talk about what does interleaved mean in this case, because it's very subtle, and sometimes you don't always get interleaved behavior when you run it, as we'll see. The parameter is the publisher to merge with, which is oftentimes, though it does not have to be, another flux. It just has to be something that can publish data. And what you end up with here is a merged fluxed instance. So this is a good example of why this is a combining operator, because it combines 2 things, one flux and a publisher, which could also be a flux, into a new flux. So the way this works is it combines items by emitting multiple publishers, in this case we're showing fluxes, to appear as a single merged flux. So let's take a look at an example. There's a more detailed example we're going to take a look at here shortly that'll illustrate this in code in more fulsome way. but we have two BigFraction fluxes, which have a bunch of big fractions in them. And we're going to merge F1 with F2, yielding a new flux that contains the elements of both. And if you look at the marble diagram, you can kind of see what's going on. You have a bunch of elements from flux F1 and flux F2, and they're merging the results together. Now, there's something a little misleading about this, because it's not necessarily always going to be the case that the values are interleaved, and we'll talk about that in a minute. They may be interleaved, and they'll more likely be interleaved under certain circumstances, especially if you're using concurrency or if you put timeouts and delays in the code. But sometimes you will not get interleaving. If you do not want interleaving and you just want one flux concatenated at the end of the other, then you should use the concateWith operator, which is similar to mergeWith, but it will not interleave. So if you take a look at the marble diagram, you can see that concateWith takes all the values of the first flux, and it takes the values from the second flux or the second publisher and concatenates them together, preserving the order in which they came in on. So sometimes you want one, sometimes you want the other. RxJava has a mergeWith that works the same way. And interestingly enough, streams actually has a concat operation method that works pretty much like this. So here's an example where you can concatenate a string to itself n times. So if you have a string, or in this case it's a list of strings, you can take the list of strings, the value n, and this makes an empty stream. And then while n is greater than or equal to 0, we're going to concatenate the current stream with the list turned into a stream, overwriting stream when it comes back. And we do this basically n times. And when we're all done, we collect the results into a list. So that's the end of this discussion of combining operators. Like I said before, there's a whole pile more combining operators that do really cool things like zipping and so on that we'll talk about later.